The land had been in my family for over a century. My great-grandfather carved our farm out of the Kansas prairie with little more than grit and a mule-drawn plow. Over the years, we added machines, silos, and barns, but the rhythm never changed. Plant, grow, harvest, repeat. That was life, honest and unglamorous. I liked it that way. Then came the development. They called it rolling acres estates, a misnomer if I'd ever heard one. There were no acres, no rolling hills, just rows of identical houses squeezed together like a bad game of Tetris. The kind of neighborhood where people paid a premium to feel exclusive while living shoulder to shoulder with folks they barely liked. And with it came the HOA. Within weeks of the first residents moving in, I received the first notice, a sternly worded letter citing visual disharmony and a failure to maintain aesthetic cohesion with the community. It was addressed to me, even though I didn't live in the subdivision. The nerve of it amused me, until I read the name signed at the bottom. Karen Whitmore, president of the Rolling Acres Homeowners Association. Karen had moved into the house nearest my eastern fence line, a gleaming white two-story with a pristine lawn that looked like it had been cut with scissors. From the moment she arrived, it was clear she saw herself as more than just a neighbor. She was a self-declared queen, and the HOA was her throne. Our first meeting was less than neighborly. I was hauling a trailer of hay when she waved me down at the edge of the easement road that cut between our properties. "You'll need to reroute that equipment," she said, gesturing to my John Deere as if it offended her. I glanced at her like she'd grown a second head. "That road's been there for 60 years. It's mine." She folded her arms, squinting behind designer sunglasses. "It's technically shared. I reviewed the plats. I'd dealt with plenty of city folk trying to play country. Karen was different. She didn't just misunderstand the land. She believed she was above it. Over the next few weeks, she escalated. HOA notices piled up in my mailbox. Complaints about the barn's rustic appearance. Noise violations for running harvesters. Past 6 p.m. She even filed a report with animal control because my goats wandered within 10 feet of her backyard. "You need to respect community standards," she said one morning as I was fixing the irrigation pump. "I'm not in your community," I replied without looking up. "This is my farm, not some landscaped cul-de-sac." She sniffed like she caught the scent of manure. "We'll see about that." At first, I tried to ignore her. Let her feel important with her clipboards and bylaws. I figured she'd tire herself out eventually, but I underestimated her tenacity and her pettiness. The tipping point came one crisp October morning. Harvest season was in full swing. The sky was clean blue, and the air carried that electric snap that told you the frost was coming soon. I had grain bins to fill and hay to stack. The big barn was the hub of it all. Everything moved through it, but when I pulled around the gravel path in my pickup, I slammed the brakes. A white Porsche Macan, Karen's pride and joy, was parked directly in front of the barn doors. Not just parked, angled like a showroom model, blocking both the sliding entrances. The SUV gleamed like a pearl dropped in the dirt, arrogant in its presence. I got out, checked the cameras, then walked the length of the easement to her house. She opened the door with a coffee mug in hand, already dressed like she was heading to a fashion shoot instead of a homeowners meeting. "Move your car," I said, keeping my voice level. She took a slow sip. "I don't respond to threats. This isn't a threat. It's a warning. You're trespassing and obstructing my barn. I'm protesting your continued non-compliance with HOA ordinances. You leave your equipment out, your barn is an eyesore, and your animals are disruptive. This is farmland, not a gated resort." She leaned on the door frame, smile smug. Then maybe it's time the farmland catches up with the neighborhood. I stared at her for a long beat. I'm giving you until sundown, she shrugged. Call a tow truck if you're in such a hurry. I did. They wouldn't touch it. Not on what they claimed was a shared right of way. So I called the sheriff. He arrived, took one look, and frowned. Not much I can do unless she's still there after a formal warning. Civil issue. I nodded, thanked him, and walked back to the barn. That's when I made my decision. She wanted a conflict. She just declared war. By dawn the next day, her Porsche was still there, still blocking my barn, still gleaming like a smug monument to arrogance. I'd half expected her to move it overnight, but no. Karen Whitmore was doubling down, as if daring me to act. The gall of it twisted in my gut as I stood there, arms crossed, staring at that luxury SUV like it had just declared martial law on my property. I couldn't get to my tractor, couldn't unload the hay bales still stacked on the flatbed behind the barn. The delay would set me back an entire day, and in harvest season, a day meant everything. I walked back to the house, poured myself a mug of black coffee, and sat on the porch as the sun broke over the silos. My old cattle dog, Trigger, flopped beside me with a groan. He watched me, like he sensed I was teetering on the edge of doing something uncharacteristic. You know what the worst part is? I muttered. She thinks this land bends to her rules. Trigger offered no advice, just a yawn. By mid-morning, Karen was back at it. I spotted her prancing across her freshly cut lawn, clipboard in hand, no doubt inspecting grass blade height, or counting decorative rocks for regulation. A few HOA minions followed in her wake, nodding like bobbleheads. She glanced toward my property once, just long enough to smile. Then she pointed at my weathered barn and scribbled something down. She was escalating. That afternoon, I tried one last olive branch. I walked the length of the easement and knocked on her door again. She opened it with that same tight-lipped smirk. It's your final warning, I said calmly. Move the Porsche. You're interfering with agricultural operations on private property. She leaned against the door frame. Oh, agricultural operations. You mean the noisy, dirty nonsense that makes this whole neighborhood smell like a petting zoo? I didn't answer. I filed a formal motion with the HOA, she continued. We're voting next week to request that your barn be relocated, or, preferably, removed entirely. I blinked. You're voting to remove my barn. Karen's grin widened. Visual disharmony. Clause 7C of the Community Charter. It'll pass. People want progress, not plows. Progress. That word scraped across my nerves like rusted steel. I turned and walked away without another word. She didn't know it yet, but she'd cast her vote. By the time dusk rolled in, I'd prepped the John Deere combine, my harvester, a 30-foot wide, 8-ton behemoth built to tear through cornfields like a hurricane. I ran a full systems check, lubricated the chains, filled the tank, and double-checked the hydraulic steering. This wasn't going to be subtle. It was going to be surgical. As twilight fell over the fields, I sat behind the wheel and watched. The barn from a distance. The Porsche still stood there, proud and glinting under the security lights like a trophy. But trophies don't belong in front of barns, and trespassers don't get to rewrite history. I waited until full dark. The hum of cicadas filled the air, and Trigger trotted beside the cab as if he knew something historic was about to happen. With a heavy exhale, I started the engine. The harvester roared to life, its lights piercing the night in brilliant yellow beams. I inched forward, slow and deliberate, the massive header blades spinning in anticipation. I approached the barn with the grace of a titan, eyes locked on that porcelain SUV still parked like it owned the place. I gave her one more chance, one long pull on the air horn that echoed across the farmland, like a warning shot. Nothing moved. No lights from her house. No footsteps running in protest. So I advanced, and the harvester did what it was built to do. Metal crumpled like paper. Glass shattered. Tires popped. Alarms screamed and died in seconds. When it was done, nothing remained but a flattened, unrecognizable mess. Bits of white plastic, twisted rims, and crushed upholstery spread across the gravel like confetti. Parked the harvester beside the barn and climbed down. Heart steady, jaw set. From across the easement, a porch light snapped on. Karen stepped outside in a silk robe, staring in disbelief at the wreckage. Her scream echoed into the night. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Let her HOA write that up. This time, she'd underestimated the man who plowed the land beneath her kingdom. By sunrise, the flattened remains of Karen's Porsche were the talk of rolling acres. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when the spectacle involved a harvester chewing through German engineering like it was dry corn stalks. HOA members showed up in droves, standing at the edge of my property in their joggers and coffee cups, murmuring as if attending a wake. Karen didn't say a word at first. She just stood at the scene in her pressed linen pantsuit, lips pursed so tightly it looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. But behind those oversized sunglasses, her eyes burned with fury. I expected sirens next. Instead, I got a summons, Sheriff. Hobbs showed up just after noon. He parked his cruiser beneath the shade of my old walnut tree and approached with a heavy sigh. Gotta say, he muttered, tilting his hat back. It takes brass to drive a harvester through a luxury vehicle. She blocked a barn. On my land. I know, he replied, rubbing the back of his neck. And between you and me, she's been stirring trouble since the day she moved in. But she's filed a criminal complaint. Property damage, reckless endangerment. She wasn't in the car. Doesn't matter, Hobbs said. She's lawyering up, wants to sue for emotional trauma, personal loss, trespassing, the works. I nodded once. Let her. He narrowed his eyes. You serious? I turned toward the barn. Now cleared. Equipment finally in motion again. I've got deeds going back 5 generations. Satellite images, property maps, easement rights, even grandfathered agricultural exemptions. Every inch of that drive is mine. If she wants a war, I've got a century of legal ammo. Hobbs gave a low whistle. Still, might be worth getting your own counsel. Already done. I'd called my cousin Liam that morning. He was a real estate attorney out of Wichita. Sharp as a tack and meaner than a barbed wire fence when it came to land disputes. Let them sue, Liam had said. We'll counter. Trespassing, obstruction of commerce, malicious interference. They want a court battle. I'll make it a harvest. But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to find a formal cease and desist letter taped to my mailbox, stamped with the Rolling Acres HOA seal and signed by Karen herself. According to it, I was to halt all heavy machinery activity within 100 feet of the community boundary or face collective legal action. I laughed all the way to the breakfast table. She still didn't get it. Later that day, I attended the HOA meeting. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Look her in the eye. The gathering was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a stucco box decorated with fake ivy and scented candles. As I walked in, every head turned. Murmurs swirled like dust in sunlight. Karen sat at the front of the room, flanked by her faithful board members, her lips twitching with the strain of forced decorum. I waited until the open floor session. Karen straightened her notes. Mr. Connors, we are here to maintain harmony and standards. Your behavior was destructive, aggressive. I raised a hand. Let's be clear. You brought your Porsche onto my property. You ignored repeated requests. You ignored law enforcement, and you obstructed a working farm in the middle of harvest season. A few neighbors shifted in their seats. She faltered. Well, yes, but it was a matter of civil protest. You called it a protest. The law calls it criminal trespass. I pulled out a folder and opened it. This is the full documentation of my property lines. Here's the easement agreement from 1984. Here are the aerial photos going back to 1997, clearly showing the barn's position. And here, I added, pulling one last paper, is a letter from the Kansas Department of Agriculture confirming that obstruction of a registered agricultural operation during active harvest constitutes a felony under state law. The room went quiet. Karen blinked, eyes darting between the papers and the watching faces. I leaned in. You built your castle on sand, Karen, and now the tides come in. She didn't speak again that evening. As I walked out of the clubhouse, I caught the eye of a middle-aged couple standing near the refreshment table. They nodded at me. Another neighbor gave a thumbs up. Maybe they didn't love the smell of hay in the morning, but they knew a bully when they saw one, and they'd just seen her get flattened. The days after the HOA meeting felt different. There was a quiet shift in the air, like the moment after a summer thunderstorm, when the pressure breaks and the sky opens up. Karen, once the undisputed queen of rolling acres, no longer strutted the sidewalks with her clipboard or berated teenagers for leaving their trash bins out. She kept to her porch, watching the world with tight lips and a hollow stare, as if waiting for someone to apologize. But no one came. The legal threats dried up quickly. Liam had fired off a counterclaim so dense with evidence, citations, and historical records that her attorney backed off before it ever reached a courtroom. The cost of pursuing her vendetta now far outweighed any illusion of victory. But it was more than legalities that broke her. It was the unraveling of control. Her spell over the HOA was broken. Neighbors who had once feared her gossip or citations began speaking freely again. Mrs. DuPont put flamingos back on her lawn. The Bailey kids rode their dirt bikes through the trails behind the houses without a peep. And Mr. Alvarez, a quiet retiree who'd been fined 3 times for parking his work truck in his own driveway, finally called a vote to limit the president's powers. It passed with an overwhelming majority. Karen was no longer president by the end of the week. I didn't gloat. I didn't wave banners or throw a party. I just went back to farming. That weekend, I finished clearing the fields. The golden haze of late September wrapped the land in a kind of warmth that only comes with hard-earned peace. Trigger trotted beside me as I loaded the last of the hay bales onto the truck. The sun sank low behind the silo, bathing the horizon in fire. I stood there for a moment, looking over the acres my family had worked for generations. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what had always been ours: dignity, legacy, and the right to exist without being buried beneath someone else's vanity. As I latched the tailgate shut, I heard footsteps on gravel. Karen stood just outside the fence. No clipboard, no entourage, just her. She looked smaller now, as if the weight of everything had finally settled on her shoulders. I wanted to see the field, she said quietly. I didn't answer. She stepped closer, carefully, like she expected the land itself to reject her. You win, she said, glancing toward the barn. You made your point. I leaned on the side of the truck. Wasn't about winning. It was about working. something you never respected. She swallowed, staring at the hay. I didn't understand. I thought this place was a joke, some stubborn holdout from a world we'd moved past. I looked her in the eye. You think life moves on without land, without food, without the people willing to wake up before dawn and break their backs so others can sip their lattes in peace. Silence stretched between us like a fault line. Karen nodded slowly. I lost sight of things. She turned to leave, then paused. I sold the Porsche. What's left of it anyway? I didn't smile. I just gave her a simple nod. Take care of yourself, Karen. She hesitated for a moment longer, then walked back across the easement and into her house. It was the last time I ever saw her on my property. Weeks passed. Fall gave way to frost, and with every sunrise, the land healed. The fields grew quiet again. The barn stood firm, scarred but proud, and the harvester, still stained with flecks of white paint, waited for next season. Sometimes the battle isn't fought with fists or fire. Sometimes it's fought with patience, with roots that run deeper than deeds. With a man and his dog, a barn, and a machine built to clear the path. In the end, Karen never truly understood what she was up against, but the land did, and it remembered.